Okay, so this is for college and high school anatomy physiology with Mrs. Callhammer. This is chapter 1, part 3. This is about the body cavities of the body, what they're called, why they're called that, and the membranes that you can find within these body cavities or surrounding them. So, your internal organs are housed within spaces, or what are called cavities. Um, and they're named according to the surrounding structures. And there's two um, major groupings, either the posterior cavities, so on your dorsal side, your back side, your posterior side. And then there's the ventral cavity, that's anything in the front, which is also called anterior. So your posterior includes your cranium and your vertebral canal. So it's totally encased in bone, anything in the posterior. And it's developmentally and physically distinct from the front side. So it's subdivided. So here we go. The cranial cavity, which encases your brain and formed by bones of the cranium. And then your vertebral canal, your vertebral column, is formed by your vertebrae, and that is where we find the spinal cord. And these images show both the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal in blue. And they are continuous with each other because the brain has the spinal cord connected to the spinal cord. So now the ventral side, the anterior side of the body, it's larger, but it doesn't completely encase or surround the organs within it with bone. And it can be subdivided into above the diaphragm, which is your thoracic cavity, and below the diaphragm, which is your abdominopelvic, which is a very fun word to use. And this is, again, great images of where they are. So thoracic cavity, your diaphragm is a muscle that makes like a dome shape. So pretty much if you think of the rib cage, behind that, that's the thoracic cavity. Right underneath that, tucked up right against the thoracic cavity, we have this muscle called the diaphragm. Then beneath that, anything beneath that is called the abdominopelvic. Here's some cavities within cavities. The mediastinum right here is literally about the medial area of your thoracic cavity. Pulmonary cavity looks like your lungs because it holds your lungs. And then the abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into the abdominal and then the pelvic cavity, just in the pelvis there. So the main difference between the posterior aspect or your dorsal side and the ventral cavity is, in the ventral side, they're lined with which are known as serous membranes. And this is a fancy word for just like kind of like a blanket. Serous membrane is a blanket of tissue, or a sandwich even, with two pieces of bread, and in the middle you have a fluid or a filling. So, two layers of a sandwich. The parietal layer lines the internal surface of the body wall, whatever cavity we're talking about, it lines that wall. The visceral layer, think of viscera. If you got eviscerated, that would be your organs. So when you see the word visceral, think of organs. The visceral layer actually is like skin on a grape, literally like skin on a grape. That layer of tissue over the organ. If the grape was your heart, the skin on it would be the visceral layer. And there's actually a space in between these two layers, the parietal and the visceral. The space in between them is called the serous cavity. And the cool thing about it, this cavity or the space, remember, their sandwich, in between it, it has fluid, a fluid called serous fluid. It's made by cells in that area, acts as a lubricant and prevents friction. So it allows organs to rub against each other without creating friction. This is a great image to show those different body cavities that I've already mentioned, the lungs in turquoise, the heart in blue, etc. Serous membranes are kind of hard to understand right away. So this image of a fist in a balloon is actually a really good one. So think of your fist as the organ. Oops. Device energy. All right, so your fist is the organ. And imagine if you stuck your fist in a balloon. This is what we would see. The air in the balloon represents the serous cavity, so that area between the two layers filled with fluid. It's like a water balloon. The lining tied up against this organ, like skin on a grape, is the inner balloon wall. That is your visceral layer, around the viscera, the organ. The other layer of the balloon, the outer wall of the balloon, is your parietal layer. So we got visceral layer, parietal, and the serous cavity that contains the serous fluid. And then more specific names of the cavities. The mediastinum, like I already mentioned, is that median space, middle space, and thoracic cavity. Contains your heart, your thymus, which is an endocrine gland, and esophagus. Trachea, major blood vessels like your aorta in that area. A specific cavity name, so we know the heart is in the thoracic cavity. The heart is also in the mediastinum, but the heart is also in its own cavity called the pericardium. And the heart has its own bag of fluids, or own serous cavity full of serous fluids. So if it has a serous cavity or a pericardial cavity, it also has the layers. And since it's specific to the heart has its own balloon around it. Think about it like that. It has its own name. So pericardium, the parietal pericardium is the outer layer around the heart. The visceral is the layer right on top of the heart. And then there's a space between the two, the pericardial cavity. And here's more images. The blue in these again represent what you need to be looking at. Visceral, pericardial, and then that's the space, and then the outer layer. The pleura is just like what I talked about with the heart, except it's specific to the lungs. The lungs have their own balloons around them. And so two layers, an inner layer, visceral layer, an outer layer, the parietal layer, and the space in between, or the cavity. When we talk about the lungs, it's your pleura. So the parietal pleura is the outer layer. The visceral pleura is the inner layer, and the space between it is your pleural cavity. Look at the pleural cavity. So this is how much fluid space is in between those two layers. This is tied up against the lungs. This is tied up against the cavity. And here's another great image showing the pericardium and the associated membranes and the fluid, and then the pleura around the lungs. And then the abdominal cavity. So if we go below the diaphragm, so below your rib cage, the part at the top that's not protected by any bones is your abdominal cavity. Think of your abs. Most of your digestive organs are in here, your kidneys, most of your uterus if you're a girl. And then below that, so the inferior area in between your hip bones is your pelvic cavity. Part of your large intestines in there, for your ureters coming off your kidneys, your bladders in there, and then your internal reproductive organs. One other serous membrane. Whew, lots of words. One other serous membrane that you need to know is called the peritoneum. So think of your abdominal pelvic cavity, it's this big open space. It also has a lining, a sandwich on the outside and right up tight against the organs, two layers. Again, it has the parietal name and the visceral name, but it's specific to the area, the peritoneum. And then there's a space in between it, the cavity that prevents friction. These images, I think, are really good at explaining it. So this is, we've taken a sagittal cut of the body. So divided the body into left and right. And that's the view that we're seeing right here. So this is the liver, this is the stomach, This is the small intestine. So it's kind of abstract and you got to reference yourself. Here's the large intestine here and here's the bladder. So the lining here in blue is the visceral layer, so right up against the organs. The parietal, you notice the blue is on the outside of that whole area, that big area. And then the area in between is the cavity. Down here, we'll talk more about these when we get to the digestive system. In humans, and we'll see it in the cats as well, but we have these things called omentums, essentially like a layer of fat, an extra layer of fat, a fat apron, they even call it this one, the greater omentum, that you'll find in the abdominal cavity. And that's what you see there. And this is another great image to show those different membranes in the abdominal cavity. So you should be able to talk about the different body cavities associated with the lungs and what are the membranes called, serous membranes, what cavity the heart is specifically called and the membranes associated with it, and what serous membrane lines the abdominal pelvic cavity and its two layers. Another way we can talk about the body is what are known as abdominal pelvic regions and quadrants. And so if you get an injury in a certain area, physicians or emergency personnel will know what organs might be impacted. Let's say if you got a gunshot wound in this area of the body. So if you, seriously, it looks like a tic-tac-toe grid, right? Do. With the umbilical region, your belly button being in the middle, your abdominal pelvic, so below your diaphragm, that's what that dotted line represents, down to the bottom of your pelvis, can be divided into 9 squares. Umbilical is your middle region. Above that is the epigastric region, below the hypogastric. I like to use the umbilical as a reference. To the right of it, it's your right lumbar region, named for the lumbar vertebrae. Then your left lumbar. Up top, we got your right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, and then below right iliac, which is by your iliac crest. Here your hip and your left iliac region. And this is something you just gotta memorize, and it's named appropriately for where in the body they're at. And then here's just another image where it's highlighted in blue where those areas are located. Umbilical, right lumbar, left lumbar, etc. If you take that same space below the diaphragm, above the pelvis here, you can divide it into 4 quadrants. And these are really easy. Right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant, and left upper quadrant. And remember, when we're looking at images, we've got to think of the body in correct anatomical position. Although this is the left side of the screen, on this human body that I'm looking at, it's the right side of their body. So you need to name it appropriately. And again, here's those same spots highlighted in blue where they're located in the body. Same with the quadrants, or right there. And that is it for part 3. All done.